The Alabama Crimson Tide have just snuck their way into the college football playoffs. Against all odds, this Alabama football team has made the playoffs. You asked me that, I don't know, 3-4 weeks ago. I'm telling you, there's absolutely no shot Alabama is playing on New Year's Day. And yet, here we are, as they are set to face against the number 1 seeded Michigan Wolverines on New Year's Day. And I'm pretty sure it's the Rose Bowl. They're playing in the Rose Bowl. So yeah, I don't know how Nick Saban did it, what magic he worked, who he had to pay off. But Alabama is now playing in the college football playoffs. And honestly, it was in a pretty controversial decision, you know? Some thought that maybe Florida State earned their spot in the college playoffs. But at the end of the day, Alabama is the better team currently. Especially with Jordan Travis being out due to injury, Alabama is a far more superior team. If you ask any college football coach who they would rather have to game plan against, they would choose Florida State over Alabama because Alabama is the better team. That's just how it is. And the reason I say snuck in is because this Alabama team hasn't been as dominant as ones in years past have been. In fact, they've had plenty of close games that they could have easily lost, such as Auburn a few weeks ago, and we'll get more into that game. But for right now, I want to talk about the game that they actually did end up losing versus the Texas Longhorns in week 2. It was a very difficult non-conference game that they scheduled, and they ended up losing by 10 points. Honestly, after they lost this game to Texas, I didn't think there was a real shot for them to make the playoffs. I knew it was still possible, but the way they had gotten beaten and the way Alabama had looked coming out of that game, I honestly didn't believe that they would be in the playoffs by the end of the year. But for some reason, some way, somehow, they are. And maybe it's because of the massive improvements that Jalen Milroe has made along the way. This man has, his talent, his skill has developed immensely over this past year of football. I would be doing a major disservice to Jalen Milroe if I didn't mention how much he's developed over these past few months. He looks like an entirely different type of player. And I don't think Alabama realized what they had on their hands until they didn't have him anymore. Because in a game versus South Florida at the beginning of the season, for some odd reason, Nick Saban decided that he wasn't going to play Jalen Milroe. Of course, the reason still hasn't been announced to the public, so we don't know why. But his replacements were 10 times worse. It took 3 quarters for Alabama to put the ball in the end zone versus a terrible South Florida team. Imagine what social media would have been like if they lost to this team. Of course, they would end up winning 17-3, but this win was not impressive at all. And of course, the committee ignores a game like this because they didn't have Jalen Milroe. They chose not to have Jalen Milroe. It's not like he was hurt or anything. They just chose not to play him. But they did go on to have some pretty impressive wins later on in the season that probably did impact the committee's decision. And one of those was against a 17th ranked Tennessee Volunteers team, okay? And honestly, this game proved one thing. It proved that the Crimson Tide could make a comeback because they struggled early on in this game. The first 2 quarters were not kind to the Crimson Tide as Tennessee would get off to an early 20-7 lead. By halftime, they were losing by 2 possessions, which doesn't happen often. If you're from Alabama, you know this. The Crimson Tide do not go down by 2 possessions. However, this was the case by halftime. And for some reason, I don't know what Nick Saban said to the boys, but apparently it worked because they would go on to score 27 unanswered points. Yes, Jalen Milroe and the gang kicked it up to a whole nother level, and for the rest of the game, Tennessee would go scoreless, and Alabama had 3 separate touchdowns. And another impressive win for the Crimson Tide came a few weeks later when they went up against Heisman hopeful Jayden Daniels. Now, Jayden Daniels has been great all year, and I do believe he has a real chance at winning the Heisman, and that video is coming up soon, so go check that out. But right now, we're here to talk about Alabama. And apparently, LSU's defense forgot to put a QB spy on Alabama, because Jalen Milroe rushed for 4 touchdowns and 155 yards. All he did this game was run the ball. That's all Alabama did. And the other 2 touchdowns that weren't scored by Jalen Milroe, they were also rushes by their other running backs. So yes, this team dominated on the ground the entire game, and that's probably why Alabama had a commanding 28-42 victory. Those games, both of those games versus Tennessee and LSU, were a huge reason for why the committee was so willing to put these guys in the playoffs. And that brings us to the game against Auburn that I mentioned earlier. Now, this was a back and forth battle. In fact, the biggest lead throughout the game was the 7-point lead that Alabama was able to grab at the very beginning. They were leading 7-0. Other than that, the next biggest lead was about 4 points. That's how close this game was. Because when one team put it in the end zone, the other would answer right back. And it looked like Auburn had this game in the fourth quarter. It was over. With 5 minutes left, Alabama needed to punt the ball, and there was almost no shot they were getting the ball back because, of course, Auburn would run out the time. Not what happened. They quite literally dropped the ball on this one as the punt returner for Auburn drops it. Alabama recovers, and then a few plays later, they put the ball in the end zone to take a 3-point lead over Auburn. And if you think Auburn was going to maybe drive down the field last minute and score, didn't happen. Because Auburn would go on to throw an interception, Peyton Thornwood, and they would lose the game 27-24. And that led us straight to the SEC championship game, where Alabama would go on to pull off the impossible versus the heavy favorites in Georgia. And Georgia proved why they were the favorites early on, as Kendall Milton rushed for a 17-yard touchdown that gave them an early 7-0 lead. However, Carson Beck struggled to capitalize on this. In fact, the entire offense struggled for the rest of the first half, as Alabama would go on to score 17 unanswered points. And that lead was good enough for them to hold on to for the rest of the game. I mean, sure, Georgia made it pretty close in the second half, scoring 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter. However, neither of those touchdowns were enough to get them over the edge, as Alabama would win the game 27-24. And that leads us to where we are today. That win is why Alabama is now playing in the college football playoffs, and Georgia's on the outside looking in, playing in the Orange Bowl. And let's be real, most of their players aren't suiting up because they are NFL bound, okay? And that's how Alabama snuck into the college football playoffs. Anyway, that's about it for this video. Let me know who you think the committee should have gone with for the 4-team playoffs. If it should have been Alabama, or if Florida got robbed, or hell, if they were going with the 4 best teams in the nation, should Georgia have been the 4th team to be put in there? Who knows? Anyway, catch y'all later. Much love. Deuces.